Welcome to the Empowering Parents program. This is session number 2, Getting Unstuck, with the It's All About Balance module. So, we're going to start off by just recognizing recently what has gone well. What changes have you made? What's been working for you in terms of your reactions, or moving from reactions to responses? And take a moment to kind of jot down those times that you were able to respond instead of react. Up next, I want to figure out how to get you stuck. Were there moments recently to which you could not move out of emotion mind or out of reason mind, and you were just kind of locked into place? So I want you to take a few moments and figure out what are those times that you are reacting instead of responding, unable to use some of the strategies we have reviewed before. And this session is going to focus on our thoughts, in particular, our judgments. Judgments are not really fact-based. They are types of thinking that keeps us in more black and white thoughts and keeps us from being effective. Some typical thoughts that we see with parents or those surrounding those that have emotion dysregulation is that the person is being manipulative, they're unmotivated, they're out of control, they're attention seeking, and they just don't want to get better. And so we're going to look at some of those specific thoughts, but you might have other judgments that really block you in terms of being able to move out of emotion or reason mind and into wise mind. So we all have judgments. We're going to kind of start by the human aspect of what judgments do. Judgments help kind of create detours in the brain. When the brain can be a little bit more efficient in terms of processing information, it's going to definitely take those shortcuts. Some shortcuts aren't ineffective. There are types of judgments that communicate to other people pretty quickly what needs to be communicated. If I say the milk is bad, it means that it's contaminated, it's curdled, it has a lot of bacteria in it that's growing, and that will make you ill. I don't actually need to say all of that information. I can just say the milk is bad, and you will understand to not drink the milk. So, when it makes sense and it is effective, judgments can be helpful at cutting down time. However, if I take that same approach and I apply it to my young person, what can happen is it locks us into emotion and reason mind. It prevents us from being able to move into more efficient problem solving and connection with our young person. So we can also move from a judgment into generalizing, and it can create moral implications about the person rather than just being about this particular situation. So these judgments can be like a slippery slope into being more generalized about the person that you're parenting. So I want you to think for a moment about some of those common judgments you have and how helpful or hurtful they have been both to you and to your young person. Kind of a tip to look for is a lot of should statements. This should have happened. This should be happening. It shouldn't have happened. The must haves, what's appropriate or not appropriate, kind of that black and white thinking. So what I want to point out is that with judgments, when we look at taking a non-judgmental stance means we're dropping all the judgments and we're stating just what is. We are not turning a blind eye to the dysfunctionality of certain behaviors. We're just not assigning certain assumptions or interpretations to those behaviors or to the dysfunctionality. And what this does is it creates less suffering. It helps you get unstuck and it moves you through your emotions and it moves you into problem solving a lot more efficiently. So what you can feel and experience is a lot less anger, fatigue, sadness, and fear or guilt, whatever the emotion might be, just by simply changing out of judgments and into a non-judgmental stance. Essentially, judgments are like adding gasoline to a fire. The fire still exists, yet it's probably a lot more containable and you can put it out faster when you don't add gasoline to it. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're working through judgments. A lot of the time, our emotions fuel our judgments, and they kind of keep building off of one another. The stronger we feel, the more we think about this, and the more we interpret the behavior in a certain way. So let's start with manipulation. A lot of folks with emotion dysregulation, especially the pervasive nature of it, there's a common judgment that they are manipulative. So I want us to kind of start there. What is manipulation? Manipulation is getting another person to do what you want them to do without really knowing that you're getting them to do that. It's pretty much a control mechanism. And so let's think about this. That takes a lot of skillful execution. That means that they're really putting a lot of thought in terms of how they're going to manipulate the person, how they're going to get those outcomes without the other person knowing that they're being manipulated. It takes a lot of skill, takes a lot of steps, a lot of pre-thinking and pre-planning. And oftentimes folks with emotion dysregulation, that's not their typical pattern. What usually happens is that someone with emotion dysregulation is more reactive to their emotions, and so they're looking for ways out of those emotions to get them relief because they're having such a difficult time regulating what the physiology is of those emotions. The hard part with that is that they often engage in the same behaviors and the same patterns continue to emerge because they're trying to get relief. They're trying to get out of that state of despair. Most of the time, when someone's in that state of despair, they're not really that forward thinking. They're not thinking, if I do this, this is what's going to happen. They're really just focused on the now. How do I get out of this despair? What's the fastest way? It's like being swept down a river. You're just looking for what branch can you grab. You're not assessing and analyzing that if I just wait 5 more feet, I can grab that more sturdy branch. You're reaching out for each branch as you can and desperately clinging to it, right? That's the pattern that you're seeing. And so what we want to do is be able to discern between, is there true manipulation? Like there was intent behind this to create an outcome that they put into place kind of step by step? Or is this a desperate behavior pattern that they have learned that the brain relies on to get them out of the state of despair and distress? So, for one example that can happen, just to give more application to what we're talking about here, when it looks like manipulation but it really isn't. Let's just say your young person struggles with depression and they come to you because they're your kid, young adult, teenager, child, whomever, and they are asking for more money from you. And you say no because you're trying to encourage them to kind of work to save and to pay certain bills for themselves. And let's say they are asked by a friend later on that day to go to the movies and hang out with them. And they decide to go and they spend all of their money, which unfortunately means that they have no money left to pay their gas and they can't make it to school or work because they have just paid all of their money on going to the movies. So you may think and you may feel like that's a form of manipulation, like it kind of puts you into a corner to end up giving them more money, which you had already previously said no to. However, if you take it from an emotion dysregulation lens, what could be happening is that this person was so depressed that they really needed the social engagement to help regulate them, and that they weren't forward thinking. They weren't thinking, if I spend this money now, I'm going to be out of money and I'm not going to be able to make it to class. I think that is problematic thinking. And it wasn't necessarily with the intent to manipulate, to just get money from you in a different way. And so that's where we have to come in with our curiosity to see, is this true manipulation or were they dysregulated and making kind of problematic decisions? Another judgment that's common is being unmotivated. They're just unmotivated or they're lazy. They're just stay in bed all day. They're not studying. They're not completing the tasks that they need to do. So things that I'd be looking at is the level of depression or the level of anxiety. Do they have that kind of like freeze response in their body when they think about performing in any kind of way? When people feel very overwhelmed, that emotion dysregulation kind of spikes and they're unable to move into active problem solving. And that can create a huge freeze response, and it can also create avoidant behaviors. So maybe they're engaging in other behaviors, but they're not engaging in the behaviors that they need to be able to continue to move towards long-term goals. This isn't usually about not wanting those long term goals, but about feeling overwhelmed and avoiding the painful emotions that come in with those responsibilities. So I think if you can kind of put yourself in that position when you've had to approach something that's really overwhelming. How did you respond to it? Did you avoid it for a certain period of time? Did it feel really tough to kind of approach that once it got to a certain level? So imagine that feeling, but amplify it times 10. So again, it's not usually about the desire to not get to a certain place in life, or it's not usually with the goal to just be responsibility less, but it is the attempt to avoid and to move away from that pain and distress because they don't know how to regulate. So, what they need to learn is how to manage that depression, that fear, that overwhelm, whatever it is that blocks them from moving into problem solving and into action. So, kind of careful on assigning meaning to their inaction or their avoidant behaviors. Being out of control. This is kind of a generalized label. It kind of speaks to the unrelenting crises that can occur with emotion dysregulation, that um, most likely you're going to see the same behavior patterns repeated. And oftentimes with emotion dysregulation, those have pretty strong consequences. It can be life threatening consequences. It can, in all sorts of ways, suicidality, self harm, disordered eating, substance use, etc. And they seemingly cannot stop themselves from acting any other way. That is behavior dysregulation. They feel very powerless often to the behaviors and to the urges once they hit in, and they don't know how to manage and to stop those behaviors and choose things to get them out of it. Hopefully, if this is the case, they're engaged in some type of framework that is geared to help them navigate those and make those changes. However, they are not an out of control person, and yet those behaviors might be out of control at this point, or there might just be times to which they are out of control in those behaviors. And we'll get to the reframing in a minute. Attention seeking is also another common label for folks with emotion dysregulation. When you have someone in despair and distress, it's not uncommon for them to kind of give up active problem solving, but in pretty drastic ways and in ways that create a lot of engagement from other people. And so you can see that others tend to be involved in their crises. Now, you could have a young person that is not that way, that you are surprised that they were experiencing what they were experiencing because it was so inhibited and so masked that you just never saw it. And for some, this can be the opposite of that, where it is kind of deemed dramatic. In terms of that, there's a lot of expressiveness and a lot of communication that comes out of this. That's not in the most effective communication patterns, right? And so think about it. If they're getting really overwhelmed and they're kind of giving up, we need people to help us at times. That's part of our hardwired nature, is that we want to connect with people in terms of our distress. However, the ways that they go about it at times can be deemed attention seeking. So we have to look at, like, is there another reason? Are they trying to connect? Are they trying to regulate? But maybe they're just going about it in an ineffective way. Attention seeking tends to kind of disconnect us from other people versus they're needing love or support, understanding, someone to listen and someone to see them and see their pain and understand where it's coming from. Another assumption that I hear is that a person with emotion dysregulation just doesn't want to get better. And in DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, we agree to accept that your young person wants to improve, that this person would if they could. So there are so many reasons as to why a person cannot, quote unquote, get better. And it's usually not because they don't want to. there's usually some type of willfulness that can show up, which means that there's some type of threat to them in terms of creating change that will improve their outcomes and build them a life worth living. But there's all sorts of reasons as to why that becomes very challenging. So, in a DBT program, in those individual sessions, that's what the individual therapist is really exploring with that person, is figuring out what blocks that effectiveness, what blocks those skills that we need to implement to really build that. So, lots of skill deficits can be kind of to blame. That's why we teach a whole bunch of skills in the year-long treatment program. But it can be hopelessness, helplessness. There can be reinforcers that have happened. That's why we look at like some contingency management. How do families respond to these crisis behaviors? How does schools respond, like teachers and classmates, coaches, friends, family, all of that? Like, what are the reinforcers that are external? And then there are sometimes internal reinforcers, like relief is often a huge reinforcer to a certain behavior and behavior pattern. And then thought distortions. What kind of thinking errors are there, and how do we kind of work to reframe them so that this person can move into more effective change? Doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want to get better. It just means that they've got a lot of roadblocks to figure out how to get to that next leg of change. So instead of taking that stance on they don't want to get better, maybe trying to focus on curiosity, like what interferes, what blocks them, what is to gain from staying in this behavior pattern? What are they benefiting from this in a non-judgmental way? So let's get into it on your sheet, on your worksheet. Let's start looking at how we practice changing our judgments towards our young person. Again, we're not really ignoring the dysfunctionality, but what we want to do instead is recognize how, or start to practice getting behaviorally specific. How can you describe the behaviors that are occurring rather than assigning meaning or interpretation to the behaviors, right? That will give us a better way to approach change with them and approach our conversations with them. So the first one is manipulative. One way to describe manipulation, or drop manipulation and describe the behavior that, prompted us to think they're being manipulative, is to say something along the lines of, he asked me to stay home and I said no. 20 minutes later, he had a panic attack and was unable to go to school. So trying to keep it specific to a certain situation and think about the big picture, right? With someone who's emotionally dysregulated, they react in a lot of ways that are ineffective to their long-term goals, but are quite effective in terms of getting relief. So we want to think about, could this be playing a role in their behavior? Does your young person have enough distress tolerance skills to really tolerate hearing a no, or responding to disappointment, fear, anger as a result? So kind of writing out, what was the sequence of events, what was actually going on, and what led to this behavior. Unmotivated. The example given, my daughter did not get out of bed until 2 p.m. and did not wash the dishes like I asked. Instead, she stayed in her room all day. You're getting behaviorally specific instead of saying, she's just unmotivated and she doesn't want to get better. So again, kind of keep in mind with this judgment that there's probably an explanation for the behavior. Like they struggle with depression, or they're kind of essentially paralyzed behaviorally by anxiety and perfectionism. Do they have pretty significant ADHD where it's really difficult for time management and breaking down tasks and being able to approach those tasks, or do they get really bogged down in that overwhelm and unable to regulate it? Okay. Out of control. He uses substances and sells my stuff in order to buy more drugs, or they're throwing up daily, or she cut 10 times this week. Instead of just summarizing they're out of control, let's behaviorally describe what's the frequency of the behavior, what is the behavior itself, what are we actually seeing showing up. Okay. Attention seeking. He acts in ways that causes others to attend to him. You want to describe the behavior and the results that happen in a non-judgmental way. Another way to say it, you can by describing a specific situation, as She cut herself deeply and needed stitches. I took her to the hospital since she needed someone there, and I spent 6 hours with her. I missed her siblings' play to be there. It can feel like attention seeking behavior, and it did have your sole focus for that amount of time, and those were the consequences that occurred. Well, again, we were just wanting to behaviorally describe what did happen instead of summarizing it into a judgmental lens. They don't want to get better. There's a reason for their lack of progress right now, or they relapsed. They don't want to get better, just will leave you more frustrated and hopeless, and it'll probably create more reactivity out of you, making it very challenging to respond in your wise mind. Your young person may or may not know what is interfering with their progress, and adding in this judgment will only prevent them from being able to figure out what those barriers actually are. Assigning this, they just don't want to get better, will shut them down more so than being able to help them figure out why are they unable to move into more progress? What was the reason for the relapse or reasons? It keeps us from analyzing and being able to really create meaningful change and prevention strategies. And so that's the thing that I'm going to point out the most is anytime we lead with judgment, it blocks us from effectively problem solving either current situations or being able to prevent other ones. So it isn't helping them, and it certainly isn't going to help you with your reactions and being able to regulate your emotions. So again, those judgments are going to amplify your own suffering. If you notice in these examples, we're not removing the facts and we're not sugarcoating it, but we are going to be more behaviorally specific so that you can move through the distress of what is instead of adding more onto it. And so, what you'll want to do is just practice this. Practice this throughout however long you need to. Recognize what those judgments are, how they add to the crises, and see what you can change them to be able to move into more of a wise mind place and get you unstuck from that emotion mind and reason mind. Best of luck.